My name is Steve, and I'm married to Jackie. If you haven't met us, or if we haven't met you before, we have the privilege of leading the team here. And this morning we're finishing our series on faith that we've called Sink or Walk. Before I jump into what I have to say, we've got another short testimony video clip. And this week we're looking at the story of Neil and Jenny Harrison. Neil and Jenny have been part of the church for some years, and they very courageously told their story on video of some of the journey of their marriage. So I'm going to ask you to turn your attention to the screens, and then I'll click into this morning's subject. So thanks, guys, at the back.
Hi, I'm Jenny.
I'm Neil Harrison. We have one daughter, which is 13 years old, Celine.
So Neil and I, of course, got married in the year 2000, and we joined in on a premarital course, which was actually awesome. And it really helped in the beginning of our marriage, and everything went well. And then about 4 years ago, I just felt that Neil and I were like passing ships, and not our communication. There was something wrong with it.
I thought nothing was wrong. Everything was fine. To me, marriage was great. Life was great. I didn't see the warning signs. I didn't see any of the issues.
So I proposed to Neil that we go for marriage counselling, which he wasn't too keen on in the beginning.
When we went to the first marriage counselling that night, I went in very reluctant. Because Jen was sitting on the one side of the couch, I sat on the other side of the couch, totally closed off, didn't want to be there, didn't want to listen. Why do we have to be here? Why do we have to tell our problems to somebody else? In that first session, obviously, Jenny spoke quite a bit. We left that night. And that's when I think I realized there was something wrong. And we went back again on a second session. And that's when things started to open up and start to unravel. Got married as Christians. We went to church. Part of a church. We did everything. But yet, there was just that little thing that was missing inside of me. And that's when the marriage counselling side actually opened it up for me a bit, where we started to communicate more, started chatting about the problems, and I actually realized what I put Jen through.
They looked at our individual relationship with God and really just, try to find out where we were individually. The expectation was high for me, for Neil, and I realized I need to just step back. And God helped me to see that in this counseling session, which was amazing. It was really good.
If it wasn't for Jen praying for me, I wouldn't be here today. Would not be here. It's through her prayers and through her obedience that she went through, brought me to where I am today. Through that process of us nearly taking separate ways to actually where we are now, we've come a very long way, and we're still learning every day. It's still a challenge. It's not easy. It's hard work, and you have to work at it.
When you come into a marriage, it's a partnership, and you've got to remember to be considerate of each other all the time. And as much as you would like your own way, you have to share it. It's one of those things that happens when you're married.
If we go through a bit of a stumble in the road, we talk about it. You don't allow the moment to take over. You don't allow the argument or the heat of that argument take over. With marriages that are currently in trouble now, stick it out. Always remember, when you stood on the altar, when you made your marriage vows, who'd you make your very marriage vows to? It was to your wife and it was to God. You've always got to remember what you said. And that's binding. It's a covenant you've made.
Thanks so much, Neil and Jen, for sharing your story. If you see them around, why don't you just high-five them? It takes a lot of courage to share your story like that, and I believe that through that video, God was speaking to some couples seated here today. And at the end of this meeting, we're speaking on faith, and I trust that as we go through this message today and as this meeting goes forward, that there'll be real faith in your heart that says, God, I want to trust you for what seems to be impossible right now. The last 2 weeks, we've picked 3 principles on faith for each week. So I'm just going to read through what the 6 were, because the numbered points this morning start at number 7. And if you haven't been at church here for the last 2 weeks, you might be a little confused by that. So we've been saying, first of all, that faith always involves risk. Faith always involves risk. We said, secondly, that true faith comes from obedience, from listening to God. Thirdly, faith involves perseverance. Then last week we said faith equals growing the Master's resources, the gold that He's placed inside our lives. We said fifthly that faith involves understanding that the Master will return and ask us, what did you do with what I gave you? And sixthly, we said that faith is anticipating the Master's reward, is that we looked at those verses, well done, good and faithful servant, and all that goes together with that. Both of those messages are available on our website or on the podcast if you'd like to backtrack and listen to them. I'd like to ask you this morning this question. What is the biggest challenge that you faced this year? What is the biggest challenge that you faced this year? I've been in a couple of different contexts this week where this question came up. Wouldn't you just take a few seconds? For some of you, it will jump to mind immediately. Others might need to think a bit. This year, 2017, what is the biggest challenge that you've faced? Perhaps like Neil and Jen, it's been marriage. When I posed this question in another meeting, one man said his biggest challenge this year, the toughest time that they've had, is that his brother died, and his mom, who lives in Pretoria, has been very, very sick, and they've had to shuttle backwards and forwards. A lady said her biggest challenge this year has been juggling all the busynesses of holding down a full-time job, being a mom of some active boys, a wife, and trying to keep everything, all the balls in the air. Somebody else said the biggest challenge this year has been being without work for the last 8 months, looking for a job, but through it all knowing that God is good. Somebody else said their wife fell pregnant and it was unexpected, and they're very delighted that God's chosen to bless them with another child, but they couldn't afford their previous child, they didn't feel. So faith was out for the financial provision for this next child that was coming along. I'd like to tell you what my answer was to that question this week when we looped it around in a few different meetings. Comrades Weekend was back in June, and on that Sunday, Jackie was lined up to run Comrades. On Friday evening and Saturday morning, we had a church leaders conference here up in the Eversky room. And on that Friday afternoon, probably around 5 o'clock, my third brother, who lives in Durban North, phoned me about the brother that's in between us. I'm one of 5. I'm the oldest, so this is my second brother, Mark. And Tim phoned me and said, Mark's just been admitted to hospital. They think he's had a stroke. And I prefer not to panic until we've had full details, but having a stroke sounded pretty bad. He had lost all feeling in the left side of his body, strength. He had been on the phone, his phone had dropped, and fortunately he was with a guy who was able to rush him through the hospital. They do a scan on his brain, and they discover a 2.5 centimeter tumor. Now, inside of your skull, your brain's not very wide. A lot of other comments I can sense coming back at me about brains there. 2.5 centimeter mass that they're 99% sure that night, they say 99% sure it's cancer. The next day, the neurosurgeon comes to see him and says, we've got to remove this. That Friday night, I shift down to the hospital. We're all in a little bit of shock. Saturday morning, I get the phone call here that morning. The neurosurgeon's been in. He says, this is very, very, very dangerous. They need to operate as soon as possible. They're looking at surgery on Tuesday, opening up his skull and taking this tumor out. Dashed down there the whole of Saturday, and it's just a whirl of emotion and pain and trying to figure things out. The doctor paints the biggest, the best possible picture of some of the risks. And he says there's a chance you could die in theater. I don't want to sugarcoat it. He says when you come out, probably you'll be under sedation for up to 2 weeks. He says after that you could be months in ICU, and then after that we need to scan the rest of your body, because if there's one, there's probably more elsewhere in your body. It was all in the space of 24 hours that at the end of that Saturday I looked back and thought, gee, the stroke would have been the good news compared to a brain tumor. I was given the unenviable task I offered, but that Saturday evening, his 3 boys, my 3 nephews, who are the most gorgeous lads, aged 9, 7, and 6, it was my responsibility that night to go and sit down with them and say, your dad is very, very sick, and you're probably not going to be able to see him for a little while. Guess what their first question was? Is he going to die? I fudged that answer. I couldn't tell. Tuesday we go back. He's in theater, 56 staples when he comes out. Massive, looked like he'd been kicked by a horse on the side of his head. The shape of a kind of horse hoof is where that opened up, removed most of this tumor. A few weeks go by, they find 9 more tumors between his neck and butt. And the journey from then till now has been a difficult one, because he's been waiting to get onto a drug trial, which the doctor says is best chance of treatment, and that had some delays. And he only started his first treatment last week, so it's been 5 months worth of waiting. I'm not even saying that my story is worse than anybody else. I'm just saying that's my answer to that question. That has been our biggest trial. We're exceptionally close. I'm exceptionally close with him, and facing this cloud hanging over him and our family of cancer has been very, very difficult. So, why do I paint such a happy, rosy picture to start off my message? Well, thankfully, this book was written for people like us who would experience real life difficulties. And this is why we're speaking for these 3 weeks about faith. Incidentally, we're not doing this at the beginning of the year when everybody's well rested, at the end of the year when sometimes you can look back and think, man, there were some tough things. So wouldn't you, if you've got a Bible, turn with me to Hebrews 11. And if you don't, the verses will come up on the screen. And this chapter is a chapter written entirely about faith from start to finish. Many different sporting codes and different professional associations have got what they would call a hall of fame, where the people of the greatest renown are kind of listed or their pictures are hung up. This chapter is a hall, if you like, of faith. And these men and women that we're going to be reading about were just ordinary people that did extraordinary things because of faith. I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but just to give you the outline of what it looks like, in case you want to read it at home, verse 1 and 2 start with the definition of faith. For the next, from verse 2 to 31, there are 21 statements that start off by faith. We're going to read about 10 of them this morning. By faith, by faith, by faith. Then at the back end, verse 32, the writer of Hebrews kicks into rapid fire. And he says, we don't have time to talk about this guy who did that. It's like rapid fire. I'm going to read that part. And then at the end, the last 2 verses, he speaks about how we get involved in this. So, reading Hebrews 11, verse 1 and 2, let's start with this definition of faith. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see. Now, faith is confident for what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. That's an important phrase. This is what the ancients were commended for. Now start his 21 statements of by faith. You ready? By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. Verse 4, by faith, Abel brought God a better offering than his brother Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. Verse 5, by faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. These are all names from the Old Testament, incidentally, if you're new to the Bible. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death, one of 2 recorded people who did not physically die. It says this, he could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. Wouldn't you like to be known as somebody who pleased God? That's God's write-up about you. The next verse gives us a clue. It says, and without faith it's impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe, there's a faith word, believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear, built an ark to save his family. Verse 8, by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. Does that sound like any of your year? Did not exactly know where I was going, but I feel God guiding me somewhere. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, that was his son and grandson, who were heirs with him of the same promise. Why did he do all of this? Verse 10, for he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God, referring to eternity. And by faith, Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was unable to bear children because she considered him faithful. Come back to that phrase just now. Who made the promise, and so from this one man, and he as good as dead, that was her husband Abraham, came descendants as numerous as stars in the sky and as countless as sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised, i.e., they did not receive all the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they're looking for a country of their own. And the rest of Hebrews 11, the next few verses have got just many other examples. By faith, by faith, by faith, by faith. And then it comes down to verse 32. So I'm going to read about another 10 verses just to give you a heads up. And this is his finish now of Hebrews 11, this hall of faith. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. Jumping down a little bit, there were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some, by faith, it's not written there, but that's what he's implying. Some by faith faced jeers and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawn in two. Anybody like to sign up for that kind of faith lifestyle? They were killed by the sword. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. And here's the last two verses of the chapter. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Man, this is an amazing chapter. Hebrews chapter 11. To help us click into this chapter and understand it, I've asked some guys to get some chairs and to label them with some of these names that we've read. So I wonder if you guys wouldn't mind getting those now, and those with labels to come and, when they arrive, stick them on. I've picked 10 of the names. Of these guys that lived by faith. Great, thanks. If we could have that one up here in the front. Thank you. Thanks, Sanele. And then those just lined up behind them. Great. Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham. Thanks, Lisa, Steph, Dusty. So there's a whole lot of names mentioned in this chapter, and I'm wanting to put them up here because I'm hoping you remember. He starts off, he says, by faith Abel gave a better offering. He trusted God with his finances. By faith Enoch. This incidentally is Genesis 4. This is Genesis 5. This is Genesis 6. This is Genesis 12. This carries on through the rest of the book of Genesis. Gideon, Samson, and Barak are all names found in the book of Judges. This guy, incidentally, if you read his story, you see he was commanded by God to lead an army into battle. He was terrified to do that. And there was a lady, Deborah, who was the judge in the nation at the time, and he went to Deborah and said, if you don't go with me, I'm not going to go. And she tensions him up. She says, buddy, because you were so pretty much scared, the victory is actually going to go to a woman. And yet, in spite of his fears, Hebrews 11 lists him as a man of faith. So it's like the writer of Hebrews just picks some examples, and then he gets down this and he says, and what about all the other people? If you can imagine, this line of chairs goes on and on and on throughout centuries, men and women who live by faith. And I've got one chair here that I've left out and put it a different color because all those guys are dead. This chair represents me. Now, if you are listening to this, please don't put the name Stephen there. That's your name. This is your chair. My chair. The writer of Hebrews goes through this whole long list. And it's like he wants us to see that these people that are listed, all their names, these guys weren't born superheroes. It was like as they popped out of the womb, took their first breath, there was suddenly obvious kryptonite and the little giveaway of a cape fluttering behind them. No, these were ordinary people that as they grew up, lived by faith. In fact, what's really encouraging for me is that many chapters in the Old Testament go on to highlight the things that they did wrong. Abraham, like he's called the father of faith in the New Testament, he lied more than once. This guy lied. This guy's name, Jacob, means deceiver. His name was eventually changed to Israel. That chap over there, Samson, he had some sexual habits that weren't all that great. The Bible doesn't try and paint the picture of these glowing superheroes living by faith. No, it's just these ordinary men and women who happen to live by faith. And he gets down to the end of Hebrews 11 and he says, actually, all of them were still living by faith when they died. It wasn't like everyone got the whole bang shoot during their lifetime, because he said God's plan is that from there right the way up to us, to me, everyone who lives by faith, the promise comes to all of us, the promise of redemption, the promise of Christ, the promise of heaven and of eternity and all of that stuff. The thing that distinguished these men and women wasn't their abilities. It was their faith, trusting in God. So, the three principles of faith that I'd like to pick up this morning from this chapter, first of all, this one, it's numbered 7th because of it's 7 in our series, is faith, we see from this chapter, is trusting in invisible God with our futures. That's what this chapter is helping us understand. Faith is trusting an invisible God, I'm using that word on purpose, invisible God with our futures. I'd like to just roll back to that definition of faith that we read. He said, now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. What we do not see, our futures, amongst other things. This is what the ancients were commended for. Eugene Peterson, when he wrote the Message Bible, paraphrased that verse, and this is what he wrote. He said, the fundamental fact of existence is that this trust in God, this faith, is the firm foundation under everything that makes life worth living. Here's the phrase I want to hone on. It's our handle on what we can't see. It's a handle on what we can't see. The act of faith is what distinguished our ancestors, set them above the crowd. Now, one of the great difficulties or mysteries about our faith is that God is invisible. It's difficult for us humans who live in a world that's based in sight, see, touch, feel, sound, to understand an invisible God who rules everything. And so you might hear somebody share a message on hearing the voice of God. And you think, now, that would be so much simpler if he was just there in front of me and spoke like you're talking to me now. Then all my problems would be solved. I'm not so sure. But as a result of God being invisible, and our faith is invisible, the actions of faith aren't, but faith in itself is invisible, this can lead to people having a lot of different questions about this invisible God. For example, why does he allow suffering? Why does he allow brain tumors? Why does he allow free choice, knowing that some people would pick to do evil actions and some of those evil actions would impact my life? Why did he allow the devil to exist, who the Bible teaches us is actively trying to aggravate God's children? Why did God allow all of that? We don't know. The Bible doesn't give, it gives partial answer to that, but not entire answer. And sometimes faith can seem so tricky because God's invisible and our futures are invisible. And as a result of this invisibility, this idea of I can't see and I can't touch and I don't know what's ahead, for many people, the result of that is that it paralyzes their faith. They say, well, I'm just going to lock my faith in a cupboard and just live everything by what I can see, feel, and touch. But the problem is that you can't see the future, can't touch the future. We plan and we hope and we mitigate our risks for the future, but we cannot control our futures. And this invisible God promises us that he is with us, he's already in our future, and he's got good plans for us in our future. So faith is saying, I trust an invisible God with my invisible future. It's what I can't see. If I could see it, touch it, feel it, it wouldn't require faith. That's essentially what Hebrews is telling us. He's saying, Abel trusted an invisible God with the future of his finances by giving the right offering. Noah trusted God with the future of his family by building this ark, which was a bizarre thing before there was rain. Abraham trusted God, the invisible God, with the future of his home. God said, leave and go. Destination to be confirmed. Sarah, Abraham's wife, trusted God with the future of her dreams. Her body is good as dead, and God says, you will bear a child. What about this chair? What about you? And what about me? Are we part of this line of faith that says, yes, I've got flaws and weaknesses, but like these people did, I too want to trust an invisible God with my future. I want to be able to reach out and say, God, even though I don't understand, I'm still willing to trust. Incidentally, this is a concept that's known to all of us, this idea of not understanding but willing to trust. I had a buddy who was trying to figure out faith and came into an alpha group that we were running. And this thing of an invisible God and faith, he was seriously tapping out. He wasn't sure how to process it. And one week he came back and this is what he said. He said, you know what, I phoned my brother who lives in England yesterday. And I realized I don't know exactly how cell phones work. I know how to dial them, and I know I can dial a button, and in a minute, as my brother answers, I'm speaking to him real time, and somewhere some satellites are transmitting something or the other, but I don't understand how that all works. I think the same would be true for most of us in this building. Yet none of us say, well, there might be one or two, but the majority of us, we don't say, you know what, until I understand everything about a cell phone, I refuse to use it. For most of us, we don't know exactly how a motor car works. I understand the vague theory. There's some guys that know exactly. But for the vast majority of us, we drive by faith. I'm not speaking about what other drivers are doing. That's just you and your car. When it comes to things here, we're willing to use things we don't fully understand and engage with them. And faith is, if you like, saying, even though I can't see with my eyes, I'm willing to reach out a hand of faith through the cloud of invisibility, knowing that the hand of God will pull me forward into my future. Second thing about faith we take out of these verses is from Hebrews 11:6. It says, faith pleases God. Faith makes God happy. When he sees people responding with faith, it pleases him. I'd like to just make a few comments on what faith is not and what it is under this idea. Because we get all kinds of confused when people talk about faith. Faith is not just a feeling of self-confidence. I woke up feeling great today, so I must have lots of faith. No, it's not that. None of these guys' lives don't show that. It's not a feeling of impulsiveness. Gee, well, that guy must have a lot of faith because he didn't know what he was getting into and he just jumped. No, that doesn't always equal up. Like the story I heard of the guy who arrives at the pearly gates, and Peter asks him, this incidentally is not from the Bible, just somebody made it up, okay? And Peter asks him, have you ever done anything of particular merit? And the man thinks for a while. He says, well, I can't think of one thing. He says, once I came upon a gang of high testosterone bikers who were threatening a young woman. And I told them to leave her alone, but they wouldn't listen to me. So I approached the largest and most heavily tattooed biker, and I smacked him on the head. I kicked his bike over. I ripped out his nose ring, and I threw it on the ground. And I told him that if he messed with her again, he'd have to answer to me. So Peter was pretty impressed by that. He said, so how long ago did that happen? The guy said, about 5 minutes. Faith doesn't just equal impulsiveness. Faith isn't just trying to use a louder voice. It's like, if I pray louder, means I've got more faith. Doesn't always equal. And faith is not a slot machine. I get up in the morning and say, God, I really am trusting you. And by 10 o'clock today, I expect this, and this to happen. That's not faith. Faith is trusting an invisible God for his plans in our future, which don't always look like our plans. And so faith it's a gift from God. It's a response to God's words. And it's childlike trust and belief. So if he says, I'm going to give you something by 10 o'clock this morning, I believe for that. It's not me dictating to God. It's me responding to God. I can, as a parent, one of the great joys of our life has been watching our boys grow and develop. And I remember so clearly the joy we had at both of them taking their first steps. Levi, our first child, we'd never owned a child who took his first steps before. And so we were watching him going through all the crawling phase and then the standing wobbly phase and the able to hold onto stuff and wobble behind that stuff phase. And then came the moment where he took his first steps by himself. I mean, if you didn't understand what was happening, you just think these guys, everybody else takes steps and they do nothing. And then this one little guy takes a pretty bad step. Pretty awkward step, and they're taking photos and messaging family and just getting so excited because he took his first steps. And yet somehow when I think about faith, I think about our Father in heaven watching us in all of our awkwardness, trying to figure things out. And as we learn to take new steps of faith, we're feeling all kinds of wobbly and awkward. And the Father in heaven, allow me some poetic license here, taking some pictures and saying, man, there's my boy, there's my girl, learning how to take steps of faith. They're soon going to learn how to walk much easier in this thing. And then another area will arrive and they'll have to learn how to take wobbly steps of faith in that thing. And then another season of faith, of life will arrive and they'll have to learn how to take new wobbly steps. And the wobbly steps don't stop coming. It's not like one day I reach Ernie and Anne's level. I'm just like, boy, the halo just turns on by itself every single morning, everything lined up. And no, they are facing new steps in different seasons of their life with different challenges and different things because God's always wanting to stretch us and move us forward. Every time we take new steps, even if we fall flat back on our nappies, it's exactly what happened to some of these guys. That's why their stories are encouraging. But the act of taking steps of faith, the writer of Hebrews says, that pleases God. It's not just, well, I'm going to work out this great plan and keep marching forward. No, God, where are you in my life? And I want to follow you. I want to do what you are showing me to do. I'd like you to notice something in verse 32 to 39. I've just done a little summary of it. It says about these guys down the back end, it says some of them conquered kingdoms, administered justice, shut the mouths of lions, became powerful in battle. How many of you would like some of that to apply to different areas in your life? Whatever the lions are in the battles, I certainly would. But then the list goes on, and if you don't mind just shooting them up for me, it says some were tortured for their faith. Some faced jeers, chains, and prison. Some wandered in deserts and mountains. Some were put to death. Now, I don't know about you, the top half of that list appeals to me a lot more. Like, okay, we're talking about faith. I'd like to sign up for the course on how you keep lions from chowing you and how you become powerful in battle, how you conquer kingdoms. That's the kind of faith I want. And the writer says, well, that's the one expression of faith, the one arm, if you like, the one muscle. But the other expression of faith is when things don't go how I'd hoped for, and I end up facing jeers, torture, prison, wandering in deserts and mountains, or facing death because of my faith. It's not faith looks a particular thing, superhero, kryptonite. No, it's faith can only be seen fully from God's perspective. And he says, all of these, every single one of them who lived by faith were commended for their faith. The final principle of faith that I like to pull out is this, is faith is trusting in Christ's faithfulness. It says this about Sarah. She considered him faithful who had made the promise. Sometimes, sitting in a chair of faith, living in a life of faith, we feel like, well, this is up to me. And my faith is directly equivalent to the popping veins on the side of my neck, the energy and intensity and grip. And of course it needs intensity. But our faith isn't in faith. It's not faith in ourselves. It's not faith in our plan. It's faith in Christ's faithfulness. Sarah trusted him who was full of faith, faithful. And so ended up achieving this promise. What was your answer to my opening question? What is your greatest challenge this year? Chances are that it's a challenge because you haven't been able to see the outcome. Haven't been able to see how it all lands. Faith is essentially trusting in Christ's faithfulness that he has got me. And he is pulling me forward. And even though I don't know what the outcome of my brother's health is going to be, God's got him. God's got us. And even if he was to die, and I have to tell you, every single one of our prayers have been for complete and miraculous healing. But even if he was to die, and so fits into that bottom category, God still got us. God still got me. God still got you. That's his faithfulness. My sister Beth, just remembering a fairly humorous story of hers, speaking about being rescued and God's got us. And she was dating a very nice guy named Greg, who is now her husband. And while they were dating, they went down to the beach with a friend, a guy and a girl. While they were down at the beach, there's some very strong rip currents, and my sister isn't confident in water because of a bad experience she had in the Umkomaas River, where she got trapped underwater. So Greg, feeling all these rip currents, just says to her, maybe just stay as shallow as you can, because there's a bit of a dip in the sand. We're going to go and swim out in front, but call us if you need us. So her and her buddy just forget, really, and wander straight into this dip and get taken by this rip current, but not swept right away, just they're feeling insecure. And when she feels insecure, she giggles. So she is giggling, but because she's terrified, and she's trying to get Greg's notice. So Greg swims back, and they have one of those classic miscommunications that occasionally happens in some of our relationships, where he's frustrated because she didn't stay in the shallows, and he's frustrated because she's giggling. So he thinks she's not taking it seriously, but she's giggling because it is so serious. So he's trying to pull her out, and she's laughing, and because he's a little frustrated, Beth decides, you know what, I don't need this guy as my lifesaver. She just waves to the lifesaver on the beach. who paddles out to them, adding insult to injury, because Greg was in no trouble. And as the lifesaver gets there, Greg just says to the lifesaver, "We have no need of you. Thank you. Please go back." I asked Beth's permission to share this story. She said, that was nearly the end of our relationship before it even started, was the silence that we had the rest of that day. But here's the thing, is that no matter how foolish we've been, how many dips we've stepped into, no matter how bad the rip currents are, it's Christ who's right with us, willing to grip us out of the danger, out of the rip currents, out of the storm. And He has got us. And so it's not just faith in my faith, it's faith in Christ's faithfulness.